We made this.
Hello and welcome everyone to a podcast devoted to the sounds of cinema and discussion about them between the notes, which is where we come in. I'm Tony Black.
I'm Sean Wilson.
And in our latest episode of Between the Notes, we will be presenting music from and speaking with composer Bear McCreary. Plus, we will talk our top 5 monster movie scores each. This is a monster movie special focusing on Godzilla, King of the Monsters, which has just been released this last week. So we're going into scary territory here, Sean. We did musicals before, which was all nice and happy, and now we're going to roar. We're going to let the beast out. That sounds really bad, doesn't it?
This is the kind of music that makes you kind of look out of your window and cower in fear at, like, what is that? It's Godzilla. This is what we want. Godzilla.
I did wonder if you were going to do an Irish accent for a minute then, because you went, what?
Look out the window, it's Godzilla. I was going to say I want to see an Irish monster movie, but there was one, wasn't there, called Wreckers? Wasn't there? I don't think either of us have included the soundtrack for that on our list, but it was basically, it's a brilliant concept, which is that a group of people in a small Irish village have to get absolutely bladdered in order to be impervious to the monsters. It's a great little film. It's really fun. It's very Irish, but it's genius.
Yeah, that is such an Irish take, isn't it, on a monster movie film?
But it just proves how many different variations on the monster movie there are, doesn't it? Which is what we're talking about.
Yeah. We need to send an email to Toho Studios to do Godzilla in Donegal. I think I'd pay for that.
Make it
happen, guys. So we are gonna talk about Bear McCreary's score from Godzilla. Sean, you spoke to Bear about the film, which we're going to intersperse some of the discussion with Bear McCreary through this podcast. But what we thought we'd start and do is actually discuss the first 3 of our choices for our 5 favourite monster movie soundtracks. So that's the hook essentially. We've picked, obviously with monster movies there's a fairly broad field. You know, you don't just have to cover things like a Godzilla, you know, or anything like that. So we've kind of gone fairly diverse, I think, into some different genres and some different kind of takes on the monster movie, because it is quite varied. So I think we've come up with some interesting choices here. So Sean, why don't you kick us off with your number 5 choice for your favourite monster movie score?
So I've gone for The Descent by David Julian, who is a composer who's unfortunately slipped off the radar in recent years. He started off being affiliated with the early films of Christopher Nolan in films like Memento, Insomnia and The Prestige, and then Nolan moved over to Hans Zimmer. I actually think this is David Julian's best score by quite some distance, actually, and it's one of my favourite British horror films and one of my favourite monster movies of all time. I imagine many people are already familiar with the concept of The Descent, which is directed by Neil Marshall, who did the recent Hellboy movie, and he also did some episodes of Game of Thrones as well as Dog Soldiers. The idea is that a group of women cavers, one of whom, Sarah, played by Shauna MacDonald, is grappling with a horrendous family tragedy in which she lost her daughter and her husband in a car accident, decides to sort of cement their bond and come to terms with the past by going on a caving expedition in the wilds of America. They go everything starts to go horribly wrong. They end up being caved in, and then there are monsters known as the crawlers down there with them, like flesh-eating, hideous, like golem-style monsters. And what the movie does brilliantly is it balances human psychological terror with very, very grisly, like full-on, like 18-rated, like monster movie gore. And it's genuinely scary, and it's genuinely a brilliant film. It was made, I think, for about £4 million. It looks like it cost £20 million. The cinematography and the direction and the conviction of the acting from everyone involved is superb, and the score is really, really great. Again, given how low budget the movie is, the score is incredibly sophisticated and rich in its soundscape. And what David Julian does is somewhat it's interesting that the movie is called The Descent, about how the environment constricts, and yet what he does is he sort of inverts that, and he has this incredibly sort of very, very sad, very melancholy theme for the central character of Sarah, which kind of builds in this kind of melancholic weight, particularly towards the end. And in the end, you've got this incredibly kind of ironic and very, very heartbreaking, really, twist. I won't give away what it is, but the music builds to this kind of incredibly tragic weight, which really underscores the fact that it's a human story, and that's why it works. And there is plenty of terrifying horror material. There's some really terrific writing for the brass section, which is incredibly frightening. It reminds me a lot of what Elliot Goldenthal would have done with films like Alien 3. I'm sure that was an inspiration. It's a really, really good soundtrack. Are you familiar with it?
Yes, but it's been absolutely ages since I've watched The Descent. But I do vaguely remember this one. I haven't had a chance to go back and listen to it, I must confess. But it's I do remember enjoying the film, and I do remember thinking it was good, because David Julian's a name that, even though he, like you say, he's sort of dropped off the radar, his name stuck with me. So when you mentioned The Descent, I was like, oh yes, David Julian. But then, so yeah, that's a good one to kick off with. I've gone for one as well, which is for my number 5, which is maybe is lower budget than some of the bigger ones, we might be talking about, and with another composer who hasn't really made a massive dent since. A film called Monsters, scored by a guy called John Hopkins, and this was the film that put Gareth Edwards on the map and led to him getting the 2014 Godzilla reboot in Hollywood. And it's a really good film that he made really sort of lo-fi, I think, on like he made the special effects on his home laptop, and it's about this man and a woman who go into like a peacekeeping zone where these giants sort of Lovecraftian monsters have sort of taken over, and it's a film that doesn't quite go in the direction you think it will, actually, but and the score is really beautiful and ethereal and melodic without being thunderous. There are points of real tension where Hopkins really does draw out a lot of the strings and things, but there are equally, it reminded me of Christopher Spellman's score for The Lost City of Z, actually, which came afterwards, but that almost felt like a bit of a nod to Monsters. Not that I necessarily think it is, but that's
a really interesting comparison, actually. Yeah, I can totally see where you're coming from there.
Yeah, and I love both of those scores. And it's that kind of the kind of scores that can sort of wash over you a little bit, and you wouldn't. It sort of feels a bit incongruous for a monster movie, but then Monsters isn't a monster movie in the sense you might think it is. So it's one that's always stuck with me, and I played a bit of it recently in advance of this, and I just think it's beautiful. Have you listened to this, Sean, before? Do you remember Monsters?
I do remember Monsters. I remember the music as it played in the film, and like you said, the movie inverts our expectations of what the monsters are, don't they? Basically, the creatures in the movie are the new normality, and it's the humans that are the aberration. And I remember the score being very, very... It captures that sense of the fact that everything is flipped. The score's got a very ethereal, kind of dreamy quality to it. The world has turned upside down. The beasts are like the new normal, and then there's that procreation scene. I mean, that's the most famous scene in the film, isn't it? That's the bit that everyone remembers, because it's staged so beautifully, and I remember the music being very powerful in that scene. There is a kind of like almost romantic quality to it. There's a sense of awe as well. I mean, given how micro budget it was, I can't imagine they must have had a lot of money for the music,
which is interesting, because John Hopkins is actually, in fairness, he's quite a big figure in electronic music. So he started playing keyboard for Imogen Heap, and then he's been producing or involved with albums from people like Coldplay, Brian Eno, David Holmes, that kind of thing. He's won Ivor Novello Awards, you know, and so he's quite a big fish in that sense, even before Monsters came along. But he's not really necessarily gone on and done a lot of, I think, film score music since. So it's he did The Lovely Bones, which was the Peter Jackson film that followed up after Lord of the Rings, his Lord of the Rings trilogy. But he's not really done much else. So it's a shame, actually. Again, it's one of you get these composers every now and then, don't you? You do these one or two of these really great scores, and then they don't seem to do much else because they've got their fingers in all these other pies.
The one I always think of with that is Daft Punk with Tron Legacy, which I think came out around the same time as Monsters, didn't it? And you know, Daft Punk, obviously not known for film scoring, they came along and did that, albeit with a lot of help from Joseph Kosinski, the orchestrator, who apparently was the one that he was the one who apparently really put the stamp on it and really brought it together. That's a magnificent score, and I think, wow, you know, what I wouldn't give for those guys to do another score along those lines again.
yeah, for sure, absolutely. So it'd be nice if Hopkins ever came out and did another one. But this is a real favourite of mine. So that's my number 5. What are you going for your number 4, Sean?
I'm completely switching things up in terms of tone. I'm going for Gremlins by Jerry Goldsmith, which doesn't that just make you grin? You just have to say the word Gremlins, don't you? And Jerry Goldsmith, both those things make me smile a lot because, as we've well established throughout this podcast, he is my favourite film composer of all time. And no, yeah, I'm going to have to talk about that someday. I am such a Goldsmith bore, and I think scores like Gremlins prove why. I mean, Goldsmith was famous for incredibly thunderous, complicated sci-fi action horror scores. Think of things like Star Trek: The Motion Picture, Alien, The Omen, Total Recall, things like that. But one of the longest standing collaborations he formed was with director Joe Dante, who doesn't make films like that. He makes incredibly wacky, satirical horror comedies that are normally set in suburbia, and which normally then implode suburbia, both figuratively and literally, with a great amount of like dark humour. And you wouldn't think that Goldsmith and him would have made great collaborators, but they did. Dante drew out a lot of Goldsmith's funnier side, because I think he just basically went to Jerry Goldsmith and said, look, the concept of each of these movies is completely insane. Therefore, I'm encouraging you as a composer to really dip into your bag of tricks and do something very, very creative and unusual from what you've done before. I mean, they worked together on like Inner Space, The Burbs, Small Soldiers, Explorers, you know, and lots of scores that mix electronics with the orchestra, which Jerry Goldsmith did magnificently well. I mean, he, as far as I'm concerned, he did that better than any other composer. That mixture of the synthetic with the organic and the way the two play off each other. And Gremlins is an interesting case because I think that although Gremlins 2, which came along in 1990, has a kind of more sophisticated mixture of orchestra and electronics, because that's the stage, that's where Goldsmith had got to in that stage in his career, because that year he also did Total Recall, which is a masterpiece. Gremlins, the first one, which came along in 1984, that's generally seen as Goldsmith's like electronic period. He was doing a lot of scores that actually ditched the orchestra entirely and just focused a lot on electronics. The synthetics in the first Gremlins are much harsher, and they're much sort of more of their time, sort of early to mid 80s than they maybe were in the sequel. But it's just brilliant. It's just such a wacky score. Like the sort of different, he throws in like cat yowls and all manner of like weird sound effects and other stuff. And the Gremlin rag, which just basically sounds like, I don't know, like a synthesized Christmas carol gone to hell. It's just really, it's wonderful, and that's a really famous. That's one of Goldsmith's most famous and enduring themes, and it just gets the mischief of the film so brilliantly well, as indeed does all the rest of the incidental music. And then, of course, you've got Gizmo's theme, which is just beautifully endearing and unbelievably sweet, and just again plays into that. Jerry Goldsmith's philosophy was you don't score the action, you score the emotion. You know, the job of a film composer is not to make something that is already obvious more obvious. You get underneath the skin of the movie and you think, right, what is this trying to communicate to the audience, and how can I further do that with music? And I think Gremlins is just one of his most eccentric and enjoyable examples of that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. It's a quirky one. It's a quirky one that is different, and that's what I like about the monster movie sort of label for this, because we can go down certain different paths, and it still applies. It still does apply in depending on what your term of monster is. So yeah, that's a good one, and we'll be coming back to Jerry soon. In the next few podcasts, we're going to be starting some Jerry Goldsmith countdown. So you never know, Gremlins might yet reappear. Who knows? We might be talking about it again.
Watch this space.
Watch this space. My number 4 then is what is the only one of our choices that we overlapped on, and I suppose it's appropriate given this podcast. But my number 4 and your number 3, we might as well talk about it together, is the 2014 Godzilla by Alexandre Desplat, which is obviously the predecessor. The Godzilla King of the Monsters is technically a sequel to Godzilla 2014, and they aren't scored by the same person, obviously. This one, I listened back to this before we recorded, and before I listened actually to King of the Monsters separately, after I'd seen the film. And I don't know about you, and you might disagree with this, but to me, this doesn't sound like a traditional Desplat score, in that it feels a little bit more. You can hear some of the traditional sort of things he often does in albums, but is this a weird choice for him to score, really?
I mean, it was interesting because, I mean, when Godzilla came out, he had done the last 2 Harry Potter scores, so I suppose in that sense there was a kind of precedent for him doing big blockbusters. He'd also done The Golden Compass as well, so it wasn't entirely unusual, but it's the kind of movie that it is. I mean, Alexandre Desplat normally ends up getting attached to incredibly classy, thought-provoking dramas. And yeah, I mean, I remember when the news came in that he was doing it, I was like, wow. I was like, Desplat getting the chance to let rip, but not let rip in a sort of fantasy sense, a la The Golden Compass or Harry Potter, because the conventions of a monster movie score are very, very different from the conventions of a Harry Potter score, which is very often about enchantment and whimsy and magic, although obviously the last 2 films in that Potter series were quite dark. But the monster movie score requires a different set of conventions, and yeah, the opportunity for him to properly let rip with, I think he described it, at the time, I remember reading an interview with him where he described the score as fortissimo, literally non-stop fortissimo, lots of brass and drums, and that is exactly. You've heard it. I mean, that is exactly what it is.
Yeah, it's a bit of a ride in a different way, and we can talk about King of the Monsters very soon, but it feels different in the sense that I think it does try and capture some of that. What's the best way to describe it? Whimsy's not the right word, but more of perhaps a sense of traditional movie magic, maybe even edging a bit closer to sort of Golden Age sort of scores than the Bear McCreary goes for the much more Giacchino style of just pure awe and terror. Whereas I think with Desplat, it's more of an adventure sort of rambunctious roller coaster ride. And I think that was an interesting way of doing it. I didn't quite get that same level of, sort of grandness necessarily from Desplat's score as I did then from the sequels.
I have to say, I think Desplat's score I think it's absolutely magnificent. I mean, there's a reason why I've included it. It's what I love about it is just how uncompromisingly dark and moody it is, and there is a theme in it. There's the central Godzilla theme, which is incredibly imposing and powerful. That plays over the opening credits, with the redacted text disappearing, and that sets the tone brilliantly. I remember seeing it in the cinema thinking, wow, this is a contemporary blockbuster monster movie that's actually got a theme. It's actually got a theme, and the theme is actually being allowed to play out in its entirety during the opening credits. That's not necessarily a guaranteed thing nowadays, but the tone of the writing, I mean, Desplat is one of the great modern day film composers. It goes without saying that his orchestral writing is incredibly sophisticated, but the use of the brass in this was so sort of thunderously powerful, and it reminded me a lot of, again, I'm going to draw a comparison with Elliot Goldenthal. I mean, it shows what an influence Elliot Goldenthal has. There were lots of sections in this where I was like, flipping heck, I could be listening to. The tone of it reminds me of something like Final Fantasy or Interview with a Vampire, and just the mixture of the horns, like you have like the sort of trilling horns, which are very like Golden Thought-esque, and indeed they're used in Bear McCreary's score as well. That's always a really, really effective device for communicating something utterly monstrous and overwhelmingly big. But also they use the taiko drums to connect it back to what Akira Ifukube did in the 1954 original. That was a lovely touch. It does, I think what Desplat was doing was very, very consciously aping the kind of time signatures and meters and instrumental tones of the early Godzilla movie, the first one, and I think he did a tremendous job. I think it's an enormously exciting and brilliant score, and then there are choral sections in it as well. Just it's juiced with just enough choir to just give that sense of awe. And I think of the Golden Gate Bridge scene, although I think most of that music wasn't actually used in that scene, but on the album the use of the choir, which reminds me a lot of maybe what John Williams did with Jurassic Park, just enough choir in it. Yeah, I think it's one of my favourite blockbuster scores of the last 20 years, without a doubt.
I think you've articulated it better there, in that's kind of, I think, what I was trying to get at, in that it's a different kind of, awe and grandeur that he puts across, and it is really complex and interesting what he does. And it just shows really that he can move into so many different genres. He can move into so many different areas and really make something impressive, and really tap into something. So it's great. It is really good. I mean, that's the thing. Much as the Gareth Edwards Godzilla was a good film, but it wasn't beloved. And you can definitely say the same, I think, about this sequel. But those scores are, top notch. Both of them, are absolutely top notch. So it's great that we're getting, even for films that don't necessarily blow you away, we're getting really great scores that do.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I think not that I want to jump ahead, but what you've just said there articulates my overall thoughts on King of the Monsters as a cinematic entity and as a soundtrack. But obviously, we won't get
teaser.
Into that yet. Yeah,
teaser for a very, very imminent discussion. Okay, well, we'll finish this with my number 3, which is the Michael Giacchino final outro, I think 8 to 10 minute piece, Raw, on the score on the soundtrack to Cloverfield. Now, this, in a way, I was almost tempted to put Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom in with this, because I feel like Raw is almost like his audition tape for Fallen Kingdom, because there's a lot of similarity for me between what he does in both of those. But obviously, Jurassic Park is maybe more of a dinosaur kind of film. I suppose it is a monster movie. I suppose they are monster movies. So I could have got away with it. But Cloverfield definitely is. Cloverfield is a take on sort of a Godzilla kind of, found footage idea, very much inspired by the Godzilla movies. But it doesn't have a conventional score, obviously. And it's only at the end of the movie we get this great fanfare, this great final, piece, Raw, which over the credits, which is just one of the, I think, in a career littered with magic, I think is one of Michael Giacchino's best pieces of work, because it's such a wonderful piece which builds from this very, very small melodic opening to this gigantic roaring, drums, strings, everything by the end. That's why it's called Raw, because it practically just booms out at you by the end of those credits. And I've loved it for years, and I think it's. And like I say, I think he took a lot of those sort of ideas and built an entire score for Fallen Kingdom around that. Hence why Fallen Kingdom is one of the best scores in recent years for me. So I think it's a great piece of monster movie music.
It is, isn't it? Because obviously, like you say, the nature of the film denies Giacchino the chance to write a score. But I like to think that producer J.J. Abrams, who of course had worked with Giacchino on Lost and Alias and Mission Impossible 3 by that point, threw him a bone and said, look, Michael, you weren't able to write a score for the movie. Do you just want to basically write an end credit suite that sums up the sort of might of a classic kaiju movie, a la what Akira Ifukube did with the first Godzilla movie? And having interviewed Michael Giacchino and knowing how enthusiastic he is, he probably went, "Yep, 8 minutes of pure musical wonderment, with a soprano vocal and a massive orchestra. Yeah, that'll do, mate." Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and he's a fantastic choice to do that. And I think, it's interesting, isn't it? Because like you say, a lot of what Cloverfield does is it embraces the conventions of those movies, yet it also subverts them as well, because it's the idea of a monster movie told from the ground up from found footage. So, and yet the tone of that music at the end does very much feel like it might belong in another movie, but it doesn't matter because it's the end credits. I mean, it just sums up the emotional experience of what you've just watched. And it sums up the sheer overwhelming bulk of the monster that goes on the rampage in Manhattan. So yeah, I think it's a great choice. I need to go back and listen to this again.
Yeah, I put it on every now and then to remind myself. I mean, I'm a big fan of Cloverfield anyway, so if I do watch the film, it's always one I look forward to at the end. It's a nice little treat. It's like the cherry on the cake, really. That piece. Okay, so that's our first set of choices for our top 5 monster movies each. We will be coming back to this at the end of the podcast, but now we're going to get into the meat of things and discuss Bear McCreary's Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
Godzilla. So, Bear, there's clearly a really rich Godzilla heritage, not just in terms of the films, but also the scores, which started with Akira Ifukube in 1954. How did you work with director Michael Dougherty to determine the themes and the sound of the music?
Well, that's a great question. And I'm glad you're including Michael in the question, because it really was a collaborative experience. The first thing that I started thinking about when I was hired on Godzilla, King of the Monsters was, what is the thematic material going to be? We're introducing 3 new monsters to the American franchise. And in Michael, the film has a Godzilla expert. I even think of Michael less as as a director and almost like a religious figure, like a priest. Like you would go to a priest and say, in the Bible, what do they say about this? And a priest would be able to say, oh, in my knowledge, I know this. And in this path, with Michael, it's Godzilla, man. I can say, Michael, like for Ghidorah, like what are the themes that people really drew from? And like, what do people expect with Mothra and Rodan? And he knew all this stuff. And it was a great experience because I have seen a number of the old films, but I was not as versed in it as he was. I mean, no one is. So the first thing we set out to do is figure out what our thematic material was going to be. And it was a big juggling act because what my goal was setting out, I wanted to write a score that had a very modern sound. I did not want it to feel like a throwback score in any way. I wanted it to have my own voice and my own personality, which is sort of inevitable. I don't think I can shut that off. But I also wanted something that referenced the work of the older films, in particular Ifukube, who created music that I think should be up there when people talk about the great themes of cinema, the great franchise themes. When you talk about Star Wars, Star Trek, James Bond, Godzilla predates all of them, okay? Like, if you had to say what is the longest running cinematic theme that has been in a franchise, I think it's Godzilla. So I think that commands respect. And it commands an acknowledgement. And for whatever reason, we've had 2 American Godzilla films that didn't use any old themes. So Michael and I wanted to fix that. I mean, we were sort of amazed that it hadn't happened. And further amazed that no one had used the Blue Oyster Cult Godzilla song. So these were all things that we talked about. And ultimately landed on kind of a 50-50 split in terms of new and classic material. For Godzilla, for Mothra, I'm using the old themes. And I'm not just using them as a cameo. They're the theme. I mean, I didn't want it to be just something that was reserved for one special moment. It's as if I wrote that theme, that's where I would use it. For Ghidorah and Rodan, I ended up writing original themes, mostly just because of the sort of shape of where those themes fit. I needed music that was done in a certain way. Plus, I just had this idea for Ghidorah that I thought was super cool. So I just had to run with it. I mean, I was really, really excited about the Ghidorah theme. And then I wrote a theme for the human characters. I wrote a theme for Monarch. And so I ended up with, 6 or 7 primary themes that I juggled throughout the film. And I think, I mean, we'll see what fans think, but I think that the score that has resulted is everything that I hoped it would be. It sounds like a score from 2019. It has some of my aesthetic and personality in there. And I think that the original themes, the Godzilla theme, the Mothra theme, and yes, even the Blue Oyster Cult song, are used in a manner that shows truly how much I love and respect them, and placed very prominently. So I'm excited to see what fans think, but I'm really proud of it. It was an incredible opportunity for me to give back to one of cinema's longest-lasting musical legacies.
For me, it's all summed up in the track that you released recently called Old Rivals. It's one of the most striking bits of film music I've heard in a long time. There's a massive amount of warring elements that come together, including the vocals from System of a Down's Serj Tankian, taiko drums, aspects of heavy metal, and the choir. How did all that come together?
It is an insane mixture. I'm not going to lie. Well, first of all, I mean, a big shout out to Greg Hayes, who mixed my score, and Jason LaRocca, who mixed and co-produced the Blue Oyster Cult song, because they really helped me literally fit all these things together. But even conceptually, a lot of it started with the idea that I wanted the score to acknowledge Japan. I mean, it's a love letter to Japanese cinema. That's what the movie is. That's what Michael is making, Michael Dougherty. So for Ghidorah's theme, which I already hinted at, I really like. But, it's Japanese Buddhist monks that are chanting. They're chanting in groups of 3 that are grouped in groups of 3. So it is Japanese monks chanting what I called like the prayer to the number 3. It's just the number 3, like in these fractal shapes. Everything about Ghidorah's theme is in 3s, and you hear that in the track that was released, Old Rivals. It's toward the end. It's this really spooky, cool color, and there's even a heavy brass thematic element that's added on top of that. So I mean, even Ghidorah's theme has multiple layers. Even Godzilla's theme has multiple layers, because in addition to the Ifukube components, I also have these chanting Japanese taiko drummers doing all their kakegoa, the vocalizations. So it was a huge task, taking all of these elements and trying to fit them together in a meaningful way. And it was painstaking and took forever. I'm not going to lie. I mean, but you got to remember, I am trying to make music for the biggest characters that exist in movies, speaking literally. The sound design, it's massive. I mean, everything about this is massive. So I really needed to make something that was detailed and complex to try to build a structure that supports it.
So obviously this is the big movie of the moment, the sequel to Godzilla 2014, directed by Michael Dougherty and scored by Bear McCreary, which obviously is, most people know the story of Godzilla, ancient monster, reawakened through atomic testing, rises up and stomps about the world while the military flail around. And obviously, importantly,
that's a brilliant description.
They do, don't they? They flail around going, "Oh my god!"
Yeah.
And then, importantly, the message of the movie is Godzilla is actually the good guy, because all you dastardly humans are the baddies with all your atomic weapons. So don't think of this big giant mutant thing trashing everything as the bad guy. And obviously in this film, and Doherty's film is not subtle about that at all. And this film is all about not just Godzilla rising, but the other monsters, King Ghidorah, Mothra, Rodan, all of these big guys from all of the Toho Studios movies that have been around for nearly 70 years, appearing as well for the first time. We've had two previous Godzilla movies. We've had the 1998 Roland Emmerich disaster. I label that a disaster movie, but not for the reasons you might think.
It's just a disaster.
Just a disaster. And then the 2014 Godzilla movie, which was a good way of doing it. It was a solid film. And then you've got this one, which really opens it up, and it's all about the Lovecraftian sense of scale and horror, and these gigantic monsters smacking down each other with a massive Hollywood budget, with a few humans noodling around in the middle. But what behind that you have Bear McCreary's score, which has been much anticipated, because Bear McCreary's been growing and growing in influence and stature for some years now. He's already done well this year with Happy Death Day to You, which we both really liked, I remember. And I think he's done a great job here, Sean. So what's your take on McCreary's King of the Monsters?
I think it's a tremendous score. Actually, it might be my favourite score of the year so far. However, it's a complicated case when it comes to hearing the score in the context of the movie itself, and I think you and me, I think, are both agreed on this, along with Amon Warman, with whom we chatted about Avengers Endgame a few weeks ago, because we had a little conversation online about this. I mean, the movie has not gone down well critically, let's be honest, and it's not all that hard to see why. I think the movie is tackled with a great deal of zeal and enthusiasm, if absolutely no thought for coherency or storytelling or character development whatsoever. It makes no sense, and I know it's a Godzilla movie, and I know I'll be the first person to admit I'm not an expert on the Toho Studios Godzilla mythology. I know it's gone through various eras. It's even been rebooted within the Japanese context, and now we're getting this new MonsterVerse, which is obviously Godzilla, Kong Skull Island, and now King of the Monsters. No one comes to a Godzilla movie for a searing indictment of the human condition, but obviously what you want is big monsters. You want spectacle, but also crucially in the 1954 Godzilla movie, it wasn't just about the spectacle, although it still stands up spectacularly now. There was a very, very sobering anti-nuclear message in the first Godzilla movie. It wasn't just about a guy in a rubber suit sort of trashing cities, which in a way that was revolutionary for the time. It was about why has this happened? What are the consequences of this? The thing is, in this new movie, I think almost as a direct rebuke to criticism of the Gareth Edwards movie, which I think was very flawed. I don't think that was a particularly coherent or great film either, but clearly as a rebuke to criticisms of that earlier movie, which was there wasn't enough action in it. Every time it looked like we were going to have a big monster fight, it would cut away. Clearly, Warner Brothers have just seemingly thrown $200 million at the project and gone, right, we want stuff. We just want, strobe-laden, apocalyptic monster on monster stuff. And I came out of it thinking, well, certainly, yeah, you can't deny that there is a spectacle to spare right from the very, very beginning, but the thing is, what is spectacle if you don't care about it? And I didn't care. I didn't care, and I didn't understand what was going on. And just it always seems like a weird thing to say, the geographical space between the characters is very, very bizarre. I mean, in the 5 years since the Gareth Edwards Godzilla movies, so we've managed to develop not spaceships, but we've managed to develop these kind of stealth bomber things that can take people from America to China to Antarctica and back again within a few seconds of screen time. And then within that, certain characters who are on different sides of the world will cross paths for dramatic purposes. No, I'm not buying that. I just don't. That seems like a very weird thing to criticise the movie for, but because these films only work if the human context is believable. you ground something in a human context, and that further contextualizes the monster spectacle, because obviously this is about seeing this incredible battle from the ground level, a la Cloverfield, although without the found footage. And if you fudge the human interaction and you fudge the dialogue, even as I accept that, you know, these humans don't have to be particularly deep, then the problem is there is an emotional vacuum in the movie. So that's my thoughts on the film. I didn't come out of it particularly angry or hating it, but I came out of it feeling, you know, pretty cold, as I did with the Gareth Edwards one, to be fair, although for different reasons. The score for me is a complicated case, in at least in the movie, not in terms of the music itself. I think the music is magnificent. It's absolutely brilliant, and I think this is an instance, you nailed it earlier when you said that the great thing about these movies is they act as a canvas on which these fantastic composers like Bear McCreary and Alexandre Desplat can paint. And I think that I'm glad this movie exists, because it really lets Bear McCreary let rip in an absolutely spectacular fashion, and the complexity of the score is very, very impressive, at least when you listen to it on its own terms, away from the incredibly noisy nature of the movie. Because when I was watching the movie, I was thinking, this is so insistent on being as noisy and kind of, it's almost like epilepsy inducing that all the visuals and the sound kind of coagulated together into this one incredibly kind of blurred mixture. And I found it quite hard within the sound design to maybe kind of pay attention to the music as heard in the movie. There were some exceptions to that. I thought that in the movie itself, Mothra's theme stood out really, really well. I love, and also in the movie, the music for Rodin's reveal was really, really good, and I think that might be my favourite track on the album, actually. The bongos and choral chanting for Rodin with the time signature changes is just enormously exciting. That worked really well in the film. There were bits and pieces of music that worked very well in the film, but I just think that in the rush to make it as sort of overstuffed and noisy and just as big as possible, I kind of think that the mixing of the sound and the music in the movie, for me, kind of left a lot to be desired. And I didn't have that criticism of the Gareth Edwards one. I thought the music and the sound were mixed brilliantly in that one. But when it comes to Bear McCreary's score on its own terms, I mean, wow. It's just... I've spoken a lot. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I agree with pretty much everything you've said, to be honest. I mean, I think there's been a lot of back and forth. I wrote a little bit about Godzilla, and the point I made was that, you've had a lot of very negative critical reviews about this film. And I think you're absolutely right. From the perspective of... And like you, I don't have any emotional connection or knowledge, particularly, of the Godzilla history mythology. I've seen the 1954 film, I've seen the 2 Hollywood films, and that's it, and the new one. So I don't have any investment in it at all. So I'm approaching this, as you are in many ways, from a different vantage point to people who've spent... one of my best friends is a massive, massive Godzilla fan, and he will be going to watch King of the Monsters with a storehouse of knowledge and, investment, and he will see a very different film to us. And all those people will go and see a very different film to us. They will go and see what they've wanted. And I think what this does deliver on, which is the sheer volume of monsters and fights and, spectacle like that, I think there are times it looks absolutely incredible. I think there are certain shots that really capture the sort of dark Lovecraftian majesty of these monsters. And I think, there were points I was thinking, wow, that's an amazing shot, that's fantastic. But it's not enough. It wasn't enough for me to really feel like I'd enjoyed it. There were points I was really bored. There were points where, especially whenever the monsters weren't on screen, I could have had a sleep.
Which is quite a lot of the movie, actually, where they're not on screen.
Exactly. It's less than in the 2014 film, which I did enjoy more, even though the characterization wasn't great in that. I prefer my monster movies where it's not about the monsters smacking each other down. I prefer it when... I always remember from the 2014 film where you first saw Godzilla. I think he was walking over an airport, and you see the plane tiny against his 1 foot, and you slowly start to see the sheer size of him. And I was like, Christ, on like an IMAX screen, You know, and Gareth Edwards made you wait for that, and he didn't overload you with Godzilla. And I kind of prefer my monster movies a bit more like that than this, where it is the end. The last half hour is just a headache-inducing, thunderous, you know. It's a Transformers movie, really. By the end, it's just they happen to not be robots; they're happening to be, you know. So I was a bit more like, oh, okay. By the end, fine. I get it now. I get the idea, you know. So I think you've got to. The way to look at this is we're going to get a different experience to people who either love all that kind of spectacle and aren't particularly bothered about characterization and drama. And you know, there are a lot of people out there who go to films just for the monsters. And a lot of people I've spoken to actually online have said, "Oh man, forget it. It's a monster movie. We're not going for drama. We're not going for that." And I think I don't really agree with that, but people are entitled to their own opinions and how they view things. Obviously, I need a bit more, to be honest, even in a monster movie. But this is getting away from the music. The music is, I think, really fitting for the film. You know, Bear McCreary really does unleash this awesome, powerful soundscape. I think, like you say, it's lost in the film. You know, there were points I was craning almost my ears to try and listen to this and try and pick out things, and all I could hear was, like, you know, a thunderous Godzilla. Yeah, right. And I was a bit like, oh, for goodness sake, just turn the volume down a bit so we can hear this music. So I was disappointed in that, but then when I got out and I listened to it on Spotify, I was immediately captured by the central theme that runs through this film, which is this great melody, this great motif. And I felt like it was Bear McCreary really, like you say, letting loose. It was him essentially doing a sort of Michael Giacchino kind of thing. He was for me. This is the score that really elevates him up towards that level. Really puts him on a par with. You could start giving Bear McCreary the big films. You could start giving him the Star Treks, the Star Wars for me now. I think he's reached that point where he could do it, and he could do it really well.
I'm so glad you said that, because I thought after listening to this score in isolation away from the film, I thought, seriously, give him a Star Wars movie now. I mean, you know, it's because the King of the Monsters score is sublime, and I think that. I mean, you mentioned the one theme there. I mean, I counted at least 6 themes in this score. I mean, you've got
Mothra's one as well. You've got that lovely Mothra song at the end, which is...
And I thought, actually, that Mothra was one of the aspects of the film that was brought across very, very well, largely because of the music, because you have this lovely choral angelic beauty which sits in very sharp contrast to the more brutal nature of the music for the other monsters. So that was an interesting kind of textural choice, and it works. But clearly you've got the adaptation of Ifukube's original Godzilla theme, because as we'll hear in the interview with Bear, he kind of hit on the fundamental question, which is why have none of the American Godzilla movies, the Hollywood Godzilla movies, used Ifukube's theme? Because he said this deserves to be held up there with Star Wars and Jurassic Park and Star Trek, and he's like, why hasn't it been used? So he set out to fix that. And I think he's done it brilliantly. I think that there is a really pleasing loyalty within the score to the mythology, the musical mythology of the Godzilla music, and I think that plays. There's also an adaptation, like you said, Mothra's song. That's as I've gone back and done my research on this, that's an adaptation of Ifukube's original choral vocal Mothra theme. There's also the theme for Rodan. There's the theme for King Ghidorah, which is in a meter of 3, because to represent the fact that he's got 3 heads. All of these extraordinary musical nuances that come out in when you listen to the score in isolation, and it's a really good listening experience as well, because very often the problem with blockbuster scores like this, when you listen to them on their own, is they become a bit of a bludgeoning experience. They halfway through you think, God, I've been hit by so much sort of symphonic action music that I'm starting to get a little bit of a headache and I'm starting to feel a little bit tired. But the way that this score is organised as a listening experience, and it's long, it's like over 90 minutes long. It's really good. It takes you on a very, very well thought out dramatic journey between these incredibly thunderous orchestral set pieces in which everything is let loose, to the more quiet, awe-inspiring moments that use the choir like very, very well. There's the moment involving Godzilla's kingdom. I won't go into any more than that for fear of spoilers, but the choral work in that, which gives this real sense of like ancient mystique and majesty, is really well done, and that's what you need. You need to play off different musical textures in order so that the listening experience is incredibly varied. And again, very little, only bits of this come through in the movie itself. Listening to the score in its own terms, I was thinking, wow, this is such an intelligent and sophisticated and overall enthusiastic way to tackle the project. I mean, every time you hear the choir chanting the various names of the monsters, I mean, you hear them chanting Godzilla, the Rodan points. I mean, I got a sense this was composed with Bear having a massive smile on his face. And it's just,
Great. It's like playing with your toys, isn't it? It's like playing with your orchestral toys and being aware that, you know, you've got, like you say, you've got a legacy you can tap into, you've got a historic theme you can tap into. You know, it's kind of like it's become a strange thing in that, you know, that you do have some of the best scores come out of some of the worst movies. And to be fair, I'm not saying that King of the Monsters is the worst movie of the year or anything like that. I really don't think that's true. I think there are definitely moments in it, and there's stuff of merit. You know, I think on a technical side, it looks really good. On a technical side, I think there's a lot to like. I think, to be honest, and I think it will really appeal to fans of monster movies and of Godzilla. But I think it's hard to really look at it from the kind of critical vantage point you and I do, and other critics do, that it's a really good film, because I wouldn't say it is. And I think it's becoming a strange thing in that some of these movies, you know, we mentioned Tron Legacy earlier, which is absolute dirge as a movie, but the score is fantastic. And it's just very telling how a composer can take the constituent elements of an idea of a film, and they can often do something that is far more impressive, far more powerful than what a screenwriter and a director and, you know, an actual team who put this on screen can do. And it's a strange thing. You would think that the great movies have great scores and the poor movies have terrible scores, but it really doesn't work out that way very often. And, you know, not always anyway. And it's a strange thing in cinema that is a case.
Well, yeah, I mean, we mentioned Jerry Goldsmith earlier. Jerry Goldsmith was the king of writing magnificent scores for terrible movies that frankly didn't deserve his input. Jerry Goldsmith did that, but because he got restless, he admitted himself, I get restless if I'm not working on a project. So very often he would sign on to a project regardless of whether the script was a complete dog or not. He would do it, and you know, I'm not suggesting that's what's happened here with Godzilla, but I think what's happened is that it's provided a canvas for Bear to come up with some really, really impressive music. I mean, it's an interesting contrast with the Desplat score, which I think is darker and mean. It's kind of got it almost like, it's an interesting thing to compare and contrast the two. I think the King of the Monsters score, you get a sense, is being composed and conducted with one fist kind of pumping the air, and the Desplat score was much more kind of like moody and like menacing. I think we touched on this earlier, but I think the really impressive thing about this King of the Monsters score is it's the first Hollywood score to really acknowledge the heritage of the franchise, the wider Godzilla Toho Studios franchise. I think that's really impressive, and to mix that with the composer's own voice, to balance those two things in a way that is coherent and listenable, and again mixes all these different textures and instrumental nuances together. I mean, I mentioned that the Rodan theme, which, you know, starts off with the bongos and the strings and then builds into the choir chanting Rodan, is enormously impressive. And in fact, that was actually one of the scenes in the film where I thought the score was actually mixed very, very well in the design, when he lays waste to the city. I believe it's in Mexico, is it? That was really well done. And I think that, I mean, what a lovely thing it is for somebody like Bear McCreary, who has worked on such a variety of projects now, going way back to Battlestar Galactica. How lovely it is to see him getting attached to a project like this that will clearly bring such a massive amount of exposure to his wonderful music. And you can hear the influences not just of Akira Ifukube, but I heard elements of like Jerry Goldsmith in here, James Horner, Alan Silvestri, all the past masters. And I think, as we'll hear in the interview, he was wonderful to talk to. You can hear the enthusiasm that he's got for this, and I think he was playing off Michael Dougherty, because he Bear told me that Michael Dougherty is like the Bible of Godzilla, and I do kind of think that maybe what's happened in the movie, and I'm with you. I didn't hate the movie. There were bit that, like you said, there were things in it that's impressive, but I think that what's happened is that, you know, any kind of in the enthusiasm for the franchise heritage has kind of stomped over anything that's kind of logical or coherent. But it's allowed for me the best score of the year so far. I love it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely up there for me. Absolutely. I'd have to think about it, but it will be there in about. I'd be surprised if it's not in my top 10 at the end of the year. Absolutely. It's a cracker. So we've been playing a bit of it. We're going to play a little bit more. Godzilla King of the Monsters is now available from WaterTower Music, so make sure you pick that up. And as we say, keep listening to Sean's interview with Bear McCreary himself.
One of your scores that I really like is Colossal, in which you scored a monster movie as if it were a melancholic drama. I found that a very intriguing approach. Are you likewise seeking out the humanity in Godzilla King of the Monsters?
That's a great question, and thank you for bringing up Colossal. I thought it was going to be my Godzilla score. I really did. I mean, I gave it my all, man. It was a big kaiju movie. And what's funny too, right, because I've also done the couple of the Cloverfield movies, that all of which had kind of kaiju adjacent elements. So I really felt like that's going to be my spin on this genre. And then I got Godzilla and got to do it for real. Yes, the humanity in Colossal is what was the driving force. It really was a dramatic human story that had kaiju elements. I applied that to Godzilla King of the Monsters in a slightly different way. I mean, I emphasized spectacle in my last description of the score, but really what I was driving toward is character. And I think it's worth mentioning, just to be clear, like why you even have themes. For 4 monsters, 4 themes. I mean, even that is worth commenting on. It's not a given that in 2019, when you do a big blockbuster movie with multiple characters, that every character has a theme that is used during their sequences. I mean, obviously in the superhero world, we've opted toward being very subtle about that. In the Monsterverse, I was not subtle about it. I wanted 4 themes for 4 characters, and I wanted to use them very overtly. Why did I do that? Because they're characters. I wanted to find the humanity within each of these creatures. And credit to Michael for crafting characters, not just monsters. I believe each of these monsters has a personality, has a motivation, has something they're fighting for. And that's all you need to provide music that underlines that character for the audience. So while I would hardly call the score intimate for most of its running time, there are several sequences that truly are. And that's where using voices, which are some of my favorite instruments, was really helpful. You know, having those chanting Buddhist monks for Ghidorah, the taiko drummers for Godzilla. I have ethereal female choirs for Mothra. It allows a sense of humanity to pop through the mix, even during the biggest battle cues. So that was... That's where I was coming from.
Would it be fair to say that across your remarkable spread of work, most of which we haven't covered, like your TV work on The Walking Dead, your film work on 10 Cloverfield Lane, and your video game music for God of War, that you're driven first and foremost by a love of character?
That's a really good question. And I almost feel like an outside perspective is the better answer on that. Like, you could answer that question better than I could. But to take a stab at it, I mean, that is the one unifying thing about my work. I pride myself on doing things that are completely different. And, like today, on the day we're recording this, I've got The Professor and the Madman coming out, which is this beautiful chamber score written in the style of sort of romantic British composers. It's very much my love letter to the Age of Innocence, going back to Elmer Bernstein. That comes out 2 weeks before Rim of the World, which is my adventurous kind of 1980s orchestral homage to Jerry Goldsmith, Dave Grusin, John Williams. And that predates Godzilla, which then leads up to Child's Play. So it's like, I don't know what any of those scores have in common other than my brain, and that each of them I try to dial into the character. And to me, that's what film scoring is, that connection between the characters on screen and the music that somebody crafts for them. I mean, when you think about Indiana Jones, he's a simple character, but the combination of those notes with those images and that actor, it's magic, you know? And that's what inspired me when I was a kid, and it's in the hopes of creating anything even remotely like that again. That's what keeps me going. That's what keeps me doing what I'm doing.
The full version of our interview with Bear McCreary may be found on Film Score Monthly online at fsmonlinemag.com. Please consider subscribing for more interviews, reviews, and all things film music. Okay, so we're going to finish things off by going back to our monster movie discussion. So we've got our top 2 choices now to just pick through. So, Sean, why don't you kick us off with your number 2 choice then?
Well, I've gone for the original King Kong from 1933 by Max Steiner, purely for the reason that this is the score that gave birth to the monster movie score. You can't have a list without this in it. Just the idea, I mean, it's easy to underestimate how revolutionary this score was for the time. And obviously this is the early days of Hollywood. I mean, one could probably say that King Kong was the first monster movie in Hollywood. I mean, it probably was. Certainly the first monster movie that was done with that level of sophistication in terms of its imagery. And I mean, that Max Steiner's score was very, very important in the development of the Hollywood film score, particularly in the use of the very heavy, like, brass section to convey a creature of absolute monumental weight and bulk. That's a musical convention that we now take for granted. I mean, when you see a blockbuster movie now and the harmonics of the orchestra tend to favour the brass section during the reveal of something huge, you kind of think, well, okay, that kind of makes logical sense. But you've got to think it was Max Steiner that did that. He was one of the godfathers of film music, along with the likes of Alfred Newman, Bernard Herrmann, people like that. I mean, Max Steiner was a very interesting case because, I mean, he also scored Gone with the Wind, which goes completely the other end of the scale. You know, you've got the Tara theme, which is one of the great grandiose romantic themes of all time. It's absolutely beautiful, and yet you've got this, which is, I mean, talk about setting a trend. I mean, it's such a powerful score even now, like so many decades on, nearly a century on. It hasn't lost any of its potency, and you can hear its influence in Bear McCreary's score for King of the Monsters. You can hear its influence in what Alexandre Desplat did with Godzilla. You can hear it in what James Newton Howard did for the Peter Jackson King Kong remake. I mean, I loved what James Newton Howard did with that, and yeah, I think it's a logical, for me, it's a logical inclusion. This is where it all started. Even if it hasn't topped my list, this is where all of these musical conventions started.
I saw this film when I was a kid. I haven't seen it since, and I went back and I listened to the score just recently, and it's fantastic. I mean, it's fantastic. My knowledge of this era of film scores is sorely lacking. It's something I need to go back and really, really concentrate on and do. But so I can't really talk about this in depth. But I loved what I heard, and you can just immediately see where so many people have been inspired by it. You know, it's incredible considering the age, 1933. You know, it's incredible to think this was out there that early. You know, for this film, it's astonishing. I once I'd finished listening to it, I was thinking, oh man, I would love to see this perform with an orchestra. Actually watch this film with an orchestra, because I think it would sound astonishing live. Yeah,
I completely agree. I mean, just to think to have been in the recording studio when he first came up with it, I mean, you think, wow, like what the executives must have been thinking, and just in terms of how well excuse me, it accompanies the imagery, just the idea of Kong scaling the Empire State Building. You know, no one had seen anything like that. So clearly Max Steiner was tasked with inventing a new musical language, really, because the film was inventing a kind of new visual language. Therefore, Max Steiner really had to step up and do the same with the music. And it was a watershed moment. It was a benchmark moment.
It's a fantastic score. My number 2 is from my year of my birth, 1982, and I've gone for John Carpenter's score for The Thing.
Good choice.
Which obviously has an interesting legacy, because it was originally Ennio Morricone who was scoring The Thing, and then that soundtrack is now out there. That score is now out there, but it was rejected at the time. And then John Carpenter brought in his it could well be his most famous score, I think, The Thing, with the kind of dum 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 dum, and then the way it builds, that fantastic. I can't think of many other films that have such a wonderful expression of ominousness in music than that. I think that is one of the greatest expressions of that in film history. Just the way that gets under your skin in the way that film does that score. And even though the film is really good anyway, I kind of think it's one of those movies that's just immeasurably improved by that score.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the film is a masterpiece. It's one of the most terrifying films ever made. I think it's John Carpenter's best movie. I think it tops Halloween for me. I mean, it's important to say that opening, that electronic pulse was actually Morricone. That was one of the pieces that Morricone did.
Right.
It's a complicated scenario because, you're right. Lots of the music was thrown out of the movie, which then weirdly, a lot of it turned up in Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight, which is kind of odd.
Yeah.
Because obviously that movie owed a debt to The Thing in a sense. But yeah, a lot of Morricone's more experimental material in the score, which again, this is the importance of listening to film scores in isolation, because very often they can take on lives of their own when heard away from the movie. But lots of material was dumped, and Carpenter did rescore certain sections of it with that kind of textural electronic like growl that you can hear in a lot of his other scores. But there was some Morricone material that did turn. I mean, I often think of the scene that's so brilliantly scored when they bring back the mutated body from the Norwegian base and then they just reveal it. And obviously Rob Bottin's prosthetics are just magnificently repulsive and horrible, as indeed they are throughout the rest of the movie. But you get these kind of high register strings that just kind of capture the kind of disgust and horror at what they're looking at. And it's icy. I mean, the words used is icy, isn't it? Which is appropriate given the landscape of the movie. But just that scene in particular, you got these high register strings that just really kind of, it almost like gives you a sense that you are being invaded by a kind of organism in a way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I think that Jerry Goldsmith was John Carpenter's original choice for this, but he couldn't do it, and then it went to Ennio Morricone, and it obviously didn't turn out to be the smoothest collaboration in the world. But yeah, to go back to the opening poll, you're absolutely right. I mean, just how dread fueled is that? Like boom 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 boom. It's
boom boom. Yeah.
It's faceless. There's nothing human in it, which is exactly what's needed to convey the menace of the monsters. I mean, for my money, it's one of the great movie monsters of all time, if not the greatest. I mean, how terrifying is it? An enemy that you can't see until it's too late. And an enemy that might also be my friend, a family member, whatever, that has completely assimilated somebody else. I mean, that's a really frightening concept, and I think that's the reason why The Thing works as a movie.
Yeah, definitely. And it's been aped so often since that, and I know ultimately The Thing has its, genesis in some earlier science fiction and things like that. But, the way that film produced it and put it out there, it's, people have been copying that for the last 40 years, really. So it's great, and that score is just unforgettable. One of the best. What's your number one is, it feels in some ways inevitable, really. I don't think you can have a list, actually, much as I didn't include it. Thinking about it, I don't think you can have a list of monster movies without your number one choice, Sean. Can you really?
Dum dum Yeah, there you go. I just need to start dum 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 dum. Yeah, it is of course Jaws by John Williams. Yeah, I mean you just need to start doing that, don't you? It's been so imitated and parodied over the years, and whenever something is parodied or copied to such an extent, there is a very good reason why. It's because it's revolutionary. It set an extraordinary precedent, and that's the reason why people feel the need to either pay homage to it or, as in the opening sequence of, say, Airplane, like completely sort of use it in a comical context.
Yeah.
John Williams had been scoring movies probably for the best part of maybe 15 to 20 years prior to Jaws, and he'd done a lot of very, very celebrated projects. I mean, he started as a jazz artist known as Johnny Williams, throughout the 1960s, but I would say it was probably Jaws that put him on the map. I mean, he'd done, obviously, the Irwin Allen, Poseidon Adventure, Towering Inferno, but it was Jaws that got him, I believe, his first score Oscar. He had won an Oscar for Fiddler on the Roof some years earlier, but it was Jaws that really announced him to the world, and indeed announced his collaboration with Steven Spielberg. I mean, the famous story is that when Spielberg came to John Williams for the music, John Williams played those two notes on the piano, and Spielberg said, "You're kidding, right? That won't work." He's like, he thought it was a joke. And John Williams said, no. He's like, you need something that is incredibly primal and instinctive, because you're not dealing with a human monster here. You're dealing with an animal that operates entirely by instinct. And John Williams said to Steven Spielberg, just wait and see what it sounds like with an entire orchestra. And you get that chugging, like, double bass theme that builds in sound. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of people just think of it in terms of those opening two notes, didn't it? But that theme actually then develops in its concert arrangement into this very typically kind of sweeping, like, John Williams-esque theme. A lot of people seem to forget that. I mean, clearly, the reason why it works, I mean, the malfunctions that they had on the set of the film, the prop shot not working, and then Spielberg having to use that kind of subjective camera, allowed John Williams' score to step up and become more of a character in the film than that it might not have been had the shark actually worked. I mean, I always think that's a very interesting thing, to think how both the score of Jaws and how the movie would have worked out had they actually used the prop shot to its entirety. It's
just one of those scores that it's so hard to it's just brilliant. I mean, it's absolutely. I mean, I should have really had it on my list. Like, I don't know why I didn't, actually, to be honest. I think I was trying to sort of go for things that I really, for films that I'm maybe more connected to, and scores that I'm more connected to. But I think, it's just fantastic. It's just fantastic all around, and it's still one of John Williams' best scores in an incredible career.
I mean, I think the other thing I did want to say was it's not. A lot of people tend to think of Jaws in terms of that main theme, because that theme is so iconic, and that's probably what got the score the Oscar, because it works it's so magnificently scary in the film. There is other material in the score as well, which I think gets overlooked, and I think this is the important thing. I think you've got the sea shanty theme for Quint, Robert Shaw's character, which is whimsical. I mean, it uses a lot of woodwinds, and it's an interesting contrast to the stark menace of the main theme. You've also got the typically brilliant Williams set pieces. You've got there are various album releases of Jaws which sort of change the track titles around, but there's one called there's a track called The Great Shark Chase, which is when they intercept the shark for the first time, and you get that brilliant bit where Robert Shaw is standing on the prow of the boat, and you get that kind of brassy, adventurous build up in John Williams' score as the camera comes flying around the boat, and it's brilliant. I mean, it's set things like that set the benchmark for future Williams adventure scores like Star Wars and Indiana Jones. You can hear the genesis of so many other great John Williams scores in other genres in this soundtrack. And yeah, I mean, I said that King Kong was a watershed moment in film score history. This is another one of those. John Williams, I can't say enough brilliant things about John Williams. I don't think anyone can.
No, absolutely. And we will cover him more at some point on Between the Notes, and I'm almost certain Jaws is going to crop up again. So we will revisit this one day. So yeah, my number one to round us off is another, not to any extent a watershed moment like some of these other scores, but I think one of the great scores of the 80s and one of the great monster movie scores, which is Alan Silvestri's Predator, which I mean, I love Predator anyway. Predator's a fantastic film. And I love this score. I think it's one of my favourites just in general, not just of the monster movie score genre, but in general. And I think because what he does so well with this, obviously Predator's set in the jungle, Arnold Schwarzenegger and his team get picked off one by one by the Predator, this alien creature in the jungle, is that he manages to create, for me, a brilliant sort of mashup of a stripped down combat sort of war movie score and a suspense thriller all in one. And there are particular, the way he uses drums to sort of, a bit like, it's sort of like The Thing in a way, but not electronic. The way he sort of builds up a kind of rhythmic dun 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 dun, and then with fanfares, with all the big orchestral sort of stuff zipping around in it. But at the same time, there's one particular track at the end. I think it's when Arnie is getting ready to take on the Predator and he's putting his war paint on.
That scene is awesome, and the music is brilliant in that scene. Yeah,
it's fantastic, and the way it just builds, with him as he's ready to go. I'm here, kill me, come on,
kill me now,
stuff.
Do it
now. I'm here, do it now. She's great. It's just fantastic. I love it to bits. I think it's one of the best scores ever. I can't say enough about it.
I completely agree with you. As soon as you said Predator, I was just like grinning from ear to ear because it's one of my favourite Alan Silvestri scores. It's one of my favourite Arnold Schwarzenegger movies as well. It's one of my favourite Arnie movies, a lot because of the music. The music is so important in the movie in terms of establishing that jungly atmosphere. And it's a claustrophobic movie, isn't it? It's incredibly scary, particularly the first time you watch it. And the music, Alan Silvestri's brilliant music, enhances that sense of claustrophobia, and it also uses sort of textures to suggest the jungle as well. And the way you get that emergent theme from the Predator on the strings, which is incredibly eerie and suggests something from another world, which then sits alongside the sort of the Commandos theme, the militaristic theme, which you see play over the opening credits. I mean, it's a score that's got a thematic base. It's got very, very clearly defined musical ideas. It's spotted brilliantly in the movie, although, again, like some of the films we've talked about on this podcast, a lot of the music was kind of truncated and moved around by John McTiernan. And although when you watch the film, the score works fantastically well. I mean, it's a very coherent sort of sound mix in the movie, which I think is very, very laudable. I mean, the other members of the production need to take credit on that as well. But yeah, I mean, particularly the last 25 minutes, in which is pretty much devoid of dialogue, really, as you get this kind of Hearts of Darkness style. Arnie reverts back to like almost ancestral, like caveman ways. I mean, what an opportunity for Alan Silvestri to build on that kind of Back to the Future style orchestral, muscular dramatics, and just the music becomes the dialogue of the movie, which is quite unusual for an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie because he's got such a strength of personality. And this is one of the reasons why I like Predator a lot, because in Predator he's facing off against a character that is actually stronger than he is, which is unusual. And the music gets that kind of tension. It's like, oh god, is Arnie actually going to win this bout? And the use of the timpani and the tribal drums and the brass, particularly during that final stretch of the movie, makes it scarier, and it makes it more atmospheric. Yeah, I think this is you've made a tremendous choice here. Yeah, I love this score to bits as well. It's one of Alan Silvestri's greatest. Yeah,
although maybe it would have been even greater if they'd have dropped a bit of the old guitar from Commando in there. The saxophone.
that would have scared the Predator off.
Arnie just whips out a sax or whatever.
Yeah. It's like, no, anything but that. Yeah. So
that's that's a monster movie top 5 each. So lots of homework there to go and listen to. I'm sure you've listened to a lot of those scores already, but there's a few you might not have done. So do go and check those out, and do check out Godzilla King of the Monsters definitely, because it is a great film, a great score to a mediocre film really. So yeah, we hope you've enjoyed our discussion about this and Sean's discussion with Bear McCreary. So well done on that one. That's a great little coup to talk to him, Sean.
Oh, he was just so much fun. That was one of the most entertaining composer interviews. I mean, you can hear it, can't you? You can hear the enthusiasm. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I love about doing interviews is when, you know, I wind it up and then I just let it go. And if I can just ask a basic question that leads to such fulsome, eloquent and enthusiastic answers like that, my job is done. So I love that, and I love hearing a film composer talk with such passion about a project that they clearly care so deeply about. It's wonderful. Yeah,
and I think you did that really well with this one. So yeah, it's a treat. So thanks for that. So we'll be back soon for in the next few weeks for another episode of Between the Notes, talking various new scores that are out there, because it's blockbuster season now. We've got quite a few big movies coming up with scores, so we'll see how they go and see what we get out of them. So thanks for joining us for this. Let's get a final Godzilla in, Sean. Go on, while we've got the chance.
Godzilla.
Perfect. That's the best one yet, actually.
You know, I actually kind of nervously looked out of the window then as I said that. I was like, oh no, is there something coming? So no, it isn't.
And hopefully Sean will be back with us unless he's stomped.
Yeah, exactly.
But either way, we'll be back soon. So enjoy all the listening you're going to do, guys. And until next time, thanks for listening to the latest episode of Between the Notes. Between the Notes is produced and edited by Tony Black, who hosts alongside Sean Wilson. You can find Tony on Twitter at AJBlackWriter and Sean on Twitter at Seano22. You can find Between the Notes on Twitter at BTW_notes, on iTunes, your podcast app of choice, on Spotify, Stitcher and on Spreaker, where the show is part of the We Made This podcast network. For more podcasts all about TV, film, books, music and popular culture in general, you can find We Made This on Facebook and on Twitter at We Made This Pod. Thanks for listening.